My dad gave my twin a Tesla for our birthday, then handed me $1, so I used it to buy the one thing that ended everything. My name is Elena Voss. I am 34 years old, and on the night of my 34th birthday, my father handed my twin sister the keys to a brand new Tesla Model Y wrapped in a red bow, then turned to me in front of 40 guests and pressed a single, folded $1 bill into my palm. The banquet hall at the Voss Freight and Logistics anniversary party went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone has just watched something humiliating happen to someone they are not related to. Consider it gas money, my father said, smiling for the photographer standing 3 feet away. Since you're always so practical, Elena. My sister Daniela laughed first, the kind of bright, easy laugh that had opened doors for her our entire lives, and then the rest of the room laughed too, because that is what rooms do when the powerful person in it decides something is funny. I stood there in my navy blue dress, the one I had bought on clearance because company money was tight that quarter, and I closed my hand around a single dollar bill while my twin sister posed for pictures beside a $90,000 car that had been purchased, I would later prove, with company funds. I smiled for the camera too. I always smiled for the camera. But that night, folding that dollar bill into my clutch purse, I made a decision that would take me 14 months to finish executing. And when I was done, my sister would not have a car, a company title, or a single person in that banquet hall still willing to call her family. This is not a story about a car. This is a story about a decade of forged signatures, a father whose mind was being quietly hollowed out by the daughter he trusted most, and a paper trail I built one bank statement at a time until it could not be argued with. If you have ever been the responsible one who got $1 while someone else got the world, stay with me because this one is for you, and if it hits close to home, hit subscribe before you keep watching, because you are going to want to see how this ends. I need you to understand something about my family before I tell you what happened. Next, because the dollar bill was not an isolated cruelty. It was the final entry in a ledger that had been open since we were 6 years old. My father, Walter Voss, built Voss Freight and Logistics from 4 trucks and a rented lot outside Dayton, Ohio, and by the time Daniela and I were born, it had grown into a regional carrier with 41 trucks, 3 warehouses, and a payroll of 92 employees. He was proud of that company the way some men are proud of a war they survived, and he wanted an heir who reflected the version of himself he liked best. Charming, magnetic, able to walk into a client's office and leave with a signed contract. That was Daniela. I was the one who liked numbers. When we were 9, Daniela crashed her bicycle into the neighbor's fence and blamed it on a dog that did not exist, and when Mr. Halloran came to our door asking who would pay for the broken slats, my father looked at me and said, "Elena, you're the reasonable one. Go apologize and work it off raking his leaves." I raked leaves for 3 weekends for a fence I never touched. When we were 16, Daniela wrapped our mother's car around a light pole 2 blocks from a party she was not supposed to be at, and my father bought her a newer car within the month, telling relatives she had learned her lesson the hard way and deserved a fresh start. I bought my first car myself, a 1998 Honda Civic with a cracked bumper, using money I had saved from 2 years of bagging groceries at the Kroger on Wilmington Pike. When we were 22 and both fresh out of college, Daniela took an unpaid internship at a marketing firm in Chicago that our father quietly subsidized with a monthly allowance he never told me about, an allowance I only discovered years later buried in an old checking account ledger. I took an entry-level accounting position at Voss Freight itself, working nights to finish my CPA license, because someone had to actually understand what the company owed and to whom, and because I genuinely loved the smell of a warehouse at 6 a.m. before the trucks pulled out. Each time I told myself the same thing. He's under pressure. The company is what matters. Don't make waves, keep the peace. I surrendered 100 small moments like that over 20 years, not because I lacked a voice, but because I had learned early that using it cost me more than staying quiet did. There is one more scene I need to tell you about, because it explains more than any of the others why I stayed silent for as long as I did. When we were 28, our mother passed away after a short illness, and in the disorientation of that year, my father asked me quietly, one night in the kitchen, to help him get the paperwork in order, meaning wills, account beneficiaries, and the deed to the house. Spent 3 weekends organizing that paperwork for him, color-coded folders, a spreadsheet of every account and policy number, because that is the kind of grief I know how to be useful in. When I finished, he thanked me, hugged me for the first time in years, and told me I was the one he could always count on. 2 days later, at a family dinner, he told Daniela the exact same thing, in front of everyone, as she described a fundraiser she had organized for a local shelter. I remember sitting there thinking, quietly, that being the one he could count on seemed to cost me weekends, and seemed to cost Daniela nothing at all, and I remember deciding, in that specific moment, that it did not matter, because at least he had noticed me that time. That is the shape grief takes when you grow up being the reliable one. You start collecting small crumbs of acknowledgement and calling them enough, because you have trained yourself to need very little. I remember one more thing from that kitchen, something small I did not think about again until years later, sitting in Renata's office with the forensic audit spread across the table. While I was organizing the beneficiary paperwork that week, I noticed my father's signature looked slightly different on 2 older documents than it did on the newer ones, tighter, more deliberate, like someone concentrating hard on a task that used to come naturally. I asked him about it, gently, and he laughed it off, said his hand cramped sometimes now, called it getting old, and I let it go, the same way I let everything go, because questioning it felt like making something out of nothing. It was not nothing. It was the earliest visible thread of the exact vulnerability that, years later, someone else would learn to use. The moment that changed was not the dollar bill itself. It was watching my father's eyes as he handed it to me, and realizing, with a coldness that settled into my chest and never fully left, that he was not being cruel by accident. He was performing a story for that room, a story where Daniela was the golden daughter who deserved abundance, and I was the dutiful daughter who deserved discipline. And he had rehearsed that story so many times over so many years that he no longer noticed he was telling it. That night, in the parking lot after the party, I sat in my car with the dollar bill still folded in my clutch, and I did not cry. I opened the Notes app on my phone and wrote a single line: no more. I did not know yet what no more would require of me, but I knew I was done raking leaves for a fence I never broke. The following Monday, I went into the office 2 hours before anyone else arrived, the way I always did, and instead of opening the routing software, I opened the company's general ledger and started reading it the way an auditor reads a ledger when they suspect something, not the way a daughter reads it out of habit. I want to be clear about something because it matters for what comes later. I was not looking for revenge. That morning, I was looking for an explanation. Because a $90,000 Tesla does not simply appear at a company anniversary party without a purchase order, a vendor invoice, and a line item somewhere. And as the person who reconciled Voss Freight's books every single month, I had never approved one. It took me 11 minutes to find it. The Tesla had been purchased through a shell line item labeled Fleet Modernization Pilot Program, Client Outreach Division, a division that, as far as I knew, did not exist inside our organizational chart. The invoice had been approved with my father's digital signature. The problem was, my father had not touched the company's accounting software in over a year. He had, in fact, stopped remembering his own login password 6 months earlier, a small detail that Daniela had mentioned once at a family dinner, laughing, saying she had just started handling that stuff for him since it stresses him out. I sat very still at my desk in the gray light of that early morning, and I felt something shift inside me. Something that was not anger yet, but was the cold, clear precursor to it, the moment right before a fever breaks. Because if Daniela had been logging in as our father, approving purchases in his name, for over a year, then the Tesla was not the first thing. It was simply the first thing I had bothered to check. Over the following 3 weeks, I did not confront anyone. I did not raise my voice, send an angry text, or say a single word to Daniela or my father about what I suspected. Instead, I did the only thing I have ever been good at, which is documentation, patient, exhaustive, time-stamped documentation. I requested read-only access to the company's full financial history for the past 3 years, framing it internally as a routine audit ahead of our insurance renewal. Which was true, we did have a renewal coming. I simply did not mention that I intended to look far deeper than the renewal required. I pulled every vendor invoice tagged to accounts my father had supposedly approved. I cross-referenced the IP addresses and login timestamps against the office's badge swipe records, because Voss Freight's building required an employee badge to enter after 6 in the evening, and every single late-night login under my father's account traced back to a badge swipe belonging to Daniela. I found 4 other unexplained purchases beyond the Tesla, a $22,000 client retention retreat to a resort in Scottsdale that Daniela had attended alone with her fiancé, a $14,000 market research contract paid to a consulting firm that turned out to be owned by Daniela's college roommate, and 2 separate wire transfers totaling $31,000 sent directly to Daniela's personal checking account, labeled internally as executive relocation stipend, despite the fact that Daniela had never relocated anywhere and held no executive title at the company. Altogether, over 14 months of records, I traced just under $140,000 in company funds that had been moved using our father's forged digital signature and login credentials. That number alone would have been enough for most people to walk straight to a lawyer. But something else troubled me more, something that turned my stomach every time I thought about it. My father was 71 years old, and over the past year I had noticed small things I had explained away as normal aging: forgetting where he parked, repeating a story twice in the same conversation, calling me by our mother's name once at Thanksgiving, and looking genuinely confused when I gently corrected him. I had chalked it up to stress, to grief, to getting older. Now, holding a stack of forged signatures in my hand, I began to wonder if someone else had noticed those same signs long before I did, and had decided they were an opportunity rather than a warning. I called Dr. Patel, our father's longtime physician, not to accuse anyone, but simply to ask, as his daughter and the person who managed his company's finances, whether it might be worth scheduling a cognitive evaluation given some changes I had observed. Dr. Patel's response chilled me. She told me she had actually recommended exactly that evaluation to my father 6 months earlier, after a visit where he seemed disoriented about dates, but that she had received a call the following week from his assistant, canceling the follow-up appointment and stating that Mr. Voss was feeling much better and didn't feel it was necessary. Voss Freight and Logistics did not have an assistant on staff who handled my father's personal medical appointments. Daniela did not work at the company in any official capacity that would have given her access to his medical scheduling. And yet somehow she had called his doctor's office, identified herself in a way that allowed the staff to believe she was authorized, and canceled an evaluation that might have revealed exactly the kind of cognitive decline that would have made every forged signature look very different in the eyes of a court. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a family dispute, and started thinking of it as what it actually was. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, carried out by someone wearing the mask of a loving daughter. Before I called an attorney, I made one more stop, because I wanted to understand exactly how the money had moved once it left the company, not just where it had come from. I drove to our father's bank, First Meridian Trust, where he had held accounts for over 30 years, and I asked to speak with someone in their fraud and elder services department, carrying a folder of the transfer records I had already compiled. A fraud investigator named Grace Liu reviewed the wire transfer records with me at a small table near the back of the branch, and I remember the particular quiet of that room, the hum of the air conditioning, the smell of fresh coffee from the customer service counter, the small stack of napkins someone had left beside the pot of creamer. Grace pulled up the account activity on her monitor, turned it slightly so I could see, and pointed to a pattern I had not noticed on my own, that every one of the executive relocation stipend transfers had been initiated from an IP address matching a residential address in the Oakwood neighborhood, an address that, when I looked it up later that evening, belonged to Daniela's apartment complex, not to any Voss Freight office. These transfers were authenticated using your father's online banking credentials, Grace told me, but based on the login pattern and device fingerprint, I can tell you with a fair degree of confidence that your father was not the one sitting at that keyboard. She could not open a formal bank-side investigation without either my father's authorization or a court order, since privacy protections legally shielded even a family member from unilaterally freezing another adult's individual accounts. But she gave me something almost as valuable, a certified transaction history report with device and IP metadata included, the exact kind of document Renata would later tell me made the difference between a suspicion and a case. I sat in the parking lot of that bank branch for almost 20 minutes afterward, the printed report resting on the passenger seat beside me, and I let myself feel, for the first time since the birthday party, something other than composure. I let myself feel grief for the father I remembered before his mind began slipping, And for the sister, I remembered before she decided his slipping mind was a door left open rather than a wound to protect. Then I drove home, put the report in a fireproof lockbox with everything else I had gathered, and went back to work the next morning like nothing had changed, because nothing could change yet. Not until every document was in place. I did not confront Daniela. I did not confront my father. I hired an attorney. Her name was Renata Ashworth, an elder law and estate litigation attorney with a small firm in Columbus who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet, devastating exploitation. And in our first meeting, I laid every document I had collected across her conference table in chronological order: invoices, wire transfers, badge swipe logs, login timestamps, and a printed email from Dr. Patel's office, confirming the canceled evaluation. Renata was quiet for a long time as she read through it. Then she looked up at me and said something I will never forget. "You didn't come here for revenge," she said. "You came here with a case." She was right. And that distinction mattered to me more than I can explain, because I did not want to destroy my sister out of spite. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, documented, and impossible for anyone, including my father, to argue away with charm. Renata laid out a plan with 3 simultaneous tracks, and she was firm that none of it should involve a single emotional confrontation on my part. First, a forensic accountant, a woman named Priya Okafor, who had spent 11 years testifying in financial fraud cases, would conduct a formal independent audit of Voss Freight's books going back 5 years, producing a report that would hold up in both a civil courtroom and, if it came to that, a criminal referral. Second, Renata would petition the county probate court for an emergency guardianship and conservatorship evaluation for my father, based on Dr. Patel's willingness to now formally document his cognitive concerns and the canceled evaluation as evidence of interference. Third, and this was the part that required the most patience from me, Renata advised that we say nothing to Daniela or my father until both the forensic audit and the guardianship petition were fully prepared, because the moment Daniela suspected she was being investigated, she would have every opportunity to alter, delete, or destroy records that were currently sitting untouched in the company's servers. For the next 4 months, I went to work every single day and sat 2 desks away from a woman I now understood had been quietly draining our father's mind and our company's accounts. And I said absolutely nothing. I brought her coffee on her birthday. I laughed at her jokes at the Friday team lunch. I let her believe completely that the dollar bill had landed exactly the way she and my father intended it to, as a small, forgettable joke at the expense of the sister who could always be counted on to absorb it quietly. Priya Okafor's forensic audit took 11 weeks to complete, and when it landed on Renata's desk, it was 94 pages long, with every fraudulent transaction traced, time-stamped, and matched against the specific badge swipe entry that placed Daniela in the building at the exact moment each login occurred. The ARB total, once Priya's deeper dive uncovered 2 additional transactions I had missed, came to $163,400. Separately, Dr. Patel completed a formal cognitive evaluation of my father, conducted at Renata's request with a court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist present, and the results were difficult for me to read even though I had suspected them for months. My father was in the early to moderate stages of vascular dementia, a condition that had very likely been present, in a milder form, for at least 18 months, meaning that for at least 18 months, every signature Daniela forged in his name had been made against a man whose capacity to consent or object was already meaningfully compromised. The county probate court granted an emergency temporary guardianship hearing date, and Renata filed the petition naming me as proposed guardian and conservator, supported by Dr. Patel's evaluation, Priya's forensic audit, and a sworn statement from Dr. Patel's office manager, confirming the canceled appointment call. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March, 14 months and 6 days after the night my father handed me a single dollar bill in front of a room full of guests. 2 weeks before that hearing date, Voss Freight held its quarterly board meeting, the same meeting where, every year, department heads presented performance numbers to the outside investors and longtime family friends who sat on the board. I had not yet been given a hearing date when the meeting was scheduled, so I sat through it not knowing whether the petition would even be granted, watching my sister stand at the front of the conference room in a tailored blazer, clicking through a slide deck that credited her personally with a client retention initiative that had, according to her numbers, increased regional accounts by 18%. I recognized the client names on her slide immediately, because I had reconciled every one of those accounts myself the previous month. And the growth she was claiming had almost nothing to do with her outreach, and almost everything to do with 2 long-term contracts our operations manager had renewed through ordinary, unglamorous relationship maintenance. Daniela stood in front of that room, entitled and radiant, describing herself as the reason the company was finally moving into the future. And 2 of the board members nodded along, charmed the way people had always been charmed by her, while I sat 2 seats away holding a folder of documents that told an entirely different story. She proposed that same afternoon that the board formally promote her to Vice President of Client Relations, with an accompanying equity stake in the company. My father, present but visibly foggy that day, smiled and said he thought that sounded like a wonderful idea, and 2 board members began nodding toward a vote. I asked calmly for the vote to be tabled pending a routine financial review currently underway, offering no further detail. And though Daniela shot me a sharp look across the table, she had no way of knowing yet how routine that review actually was. The vote was tabled. She would not get another chance to ask for it. I did not tell Daniela the hearing existed. She found out the way most people find out their carefully built story has collapsed when the paperwork arrived at her door. 2 days before the hearing, a process server delivered formal notice to Daniela's apartment, informing her of the guardianship petition, the forensic audit findings, and her legal right to appear and respond. She called me 11 times that afternoon. I did not answer, on Renata's advice, because anything I said informally could later be characterized as coercion, pressure, or an attempt to intimidate a witness, and Renata wanted every single interaction from this point forward to happen on the record, in a room with a court reporter present. Daniela showed up at the office the next morning anyway, and I remember every detail of it with the strange, sharpened clarity that only comes with a memory you know you will replay for the rest of your life. She walked in wearing the cream-colored coat she always wore when she wanted to look like she had already won an argument, and she stopped in front of my desk with her hands on her hips, loud enough that half the accounting floor turned to look. "You went behind my back," she said. "After everything I've done for Dad, you're trying to make me look like a criminal in front of a judge." I looked up at her, and I felt something I had never felt in a confrontation with my sister before. A kind of stillness. The stillness of someone standing on solid ground for the first time in a long time. "I didn't make you look like anything," I said. "I found what you did. The court just gets to see it now." "This is a family matter," she said, her voice rising. "You're humiliating me over a car." "It was never about the car," I said. "It's about $163,000 and a doctor's appointment you canceled so Dad wouldn't get diagnosed before you needed his signature again." The color left her face. She had not known I knew about the canceled appointment, and in that moment, I watched her realize exactly how much ground she had already lost. Because I was not guessing. I was reciting facts from a 94-page report that had already been filed with the court. She did not have a rebuttal, only volume, and volume does not survive contact with a paper trail. She left the office without another word, and I sat back down at my desk and finished the invoice reconciliation I had been working on when she walked in, because the work still needed to be done, and because I had promised myself I would let the documents carry the weight, not my anger. The guardianship and conservatorship hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the Montgomery County Probate Courthouse, in a wood-paneled room that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee from the machine down the hall. My father sat beside me, dressed in the navy suit he used to wear to client meetings, looking smaller than I remembered him, his hands folded in, his lap occasionally turning to me and asking quietly what building we were in. Daniela sat across the aisle with her own attorney, a man who spent most of the hearing looking at his notes rather than at the judge, because there was very little he could argue against a 94-page forensic audit and a licensed geriatric psychiatrist's sworn testimony. Priya Okafor testified first, walking the judge through the transaction records with the same calm precision she had shown me in every meeting we had. No adjectives, no accusations, only dates, dollar amounts, login credentials, and badge swipe timestamps laid side by side until the pattern spoke for itself. Dr. Patel testified next, describing my father's diagnosis, the timeline of his cognitive decline, and the canceled evaluation, her voice steady but visibly troubled as she explained that had the original appointment gone forward, we very likely would have identified the need for protective oversight nearly a year earlier than we did. When it was Daniela's turn to respond, her attorney offered the only defense available to him, that she had been helping our father manage stress and administrative burden, and that any financial transfers were intended as informal compensation for that help. The judge, a woman named Judge Owusu, who had clearly read every page of the filed evidence before that morning, asked a single question that ended the argument before it could continue. Ms. Voss, did your father ever formally authorize you, in writing, prior to any of these transactions, to act on his behalf financially? Daniela did not answer immediately. No, Your Honor, her attorney finally said. There was no formal authorization. At the time. Judge Owusu nodded slowly, made a note, and turned to address the room. Then what we have, she said, is not informal help. It is unauthorized use of a vulnerable adult's identity and assets over an extended period with active interference in his medical care. Before the ruling, Judge Owusu asked to hear briefly from my father directly, gently, the way you speak to someone you are trying not to startle, asking him simple questions about the date, the name of the company he built, and who he trusted, to help him make decisions. My father answered the first two questions slowly but correctly, and when asked who he trusted, he looked across the room, past Daniela, past the attorneys, and found my face. Elena, he said. She's always been the one who tells me the truth, even when it isn't easy to hear. I do not think he fully understood in that moment everything the hearing was about, but he understood that much. And it was the truest thing anyone in that courtroom said all morning. The guardianship and conservatorship were granted to me that morning, with full oversight of my father's medical and financial decisions, and the court ordered an immediate freeze on any accounts Daniela had access to, along with a formal referral of the forensic audit to the county prosecutor's office for review of possible elder financial exploitation charges. I did not smile when the ruling was read. I did not look at Daniela. I reached over and took my father's hand, because he had leaned toward me partway through the hearing and asked in a small voice I had not heard from him since I was a child, "Is everything going to be okay, Ellie?" "Yes, Dad," I told him. "Everything is going to be okay now." The company's board of directors, made up mostly of longtime family friends and two outside investors, had been quietly briefed by Renata in the week leading up to the hearing, and within days of the ruling, they voted unanimously to remove Daniela from any signing authority, revoke her badge access to the building, and formally place operational control of Voss Freight and Logistics under my management as court-appointed conservator of my father's estate, which included his controlling interest. In the company, the extended family group chat, which had gone mostly quiet in the months leading up to the hearing while everyone waited to see how things would unfold, exploded the same evening the news became public. Aunt Carol, who had spent 2 decades gently defending Daniela's every misstep with a version of, "She just has a bigger personality," wrote a single line into the chat. "I am so sorry, Elena. We should have listened to you years ago." Cousin Marcus, who had once loudly toasted Daniela's Tesla at the very party where I received my $1, wrote that he had no idea and that he would be reaching out to Dad separately. Daniela left the chat entirely within the hour. Within 3 weeks, her engagement to her fiancé, a man named Trent who worked in commercial real estate and had attended every family function with the easy confidence of someone marrying into money, quietly ended, and mutual friends later confirmed that the county prosecutor's office had reached out to Trent as a potential witness regarding the Scottsdale retreat expenses. Her firm let her go from the marketing consulting position she had taken after leaving. Voss Freight, citing, in the careful language companies use, concerns raised during a routine background review process. I did not orchestrate any of that. I did not need to. I had simply stopped protecting her from the consequences of things she had already done, and the moment the protection was gone, the consequences arrived on their own schedule, in their own order, exactly the way consequences do when no one is standing in front of them anymore. The Tesla itself was recovered as part of the asset freeze, sold at fair market value, and the proceeds returned to Voss Freight's accounts as part of the restitution the court ordered, along with a structured repayment plan for the remaining balance secured against Daniela's future earnings and any assets she held. I want to be honest with you about how it felt watching a tow truck take that car away from the apartment complex where Daniela had been living. Because I know some of you are expecting me to say it felt like victory, and it did not. It felt quiet. It felt like something finally being put back where it belonged. my father's guardianship remains in place today, and I visit him every single evening after work, not because a court requires it, but because I am his daughter, and because for the first time in my adult life, the time I spend with him is not shadowed by wondering what someone else is doing with his signature while I'm not in the room. The house is quieter now than it used to be. In the specific way a house gets quiet once you remove the person who was constantly performing for an audience only they could see. I changed the locks on the house myself on a Saturday morning, kneeling on the front porch with a screwdriver and a new deadbolt from the hardware store, and I remember the small, physical satisfaction of that click when the new mechanism finally turned over. Daniela's old key does not work anymore, on the house or on the office, and her name has been removed from every account, every badge system, and every authorized signer list at First Meridian Trust. Some evenings I sit with my father on the back porch while he drinks decaf and asks me, sometimes for the second time in an hour, how the warehouse on Route 4 is running, and I answer him patiently every time. Because patience, I have learned, is not the same thing as weakness. It is simply a choice about where to spend your energy. He does not ask about Daniela very often anymore, and when he does, I tell him the truth in small, gentle pieces that she is not working at the company right now, that she needed to focus on some things of her own, and he nods and lets it go, in the way that his condition sometimes mercifully allows him to let things go. I do not know if he will ever fully understand what happened, and some days I am grateful for that, because there is a kindness in a mind that cannot hold on to every betrayal at once. I moved into the role of overseeing the company full-time, not as an act of triumph, but because someone needed to steady the ship, and I had spent 14 years learning exactly how to do that. The employees who had worked at Voss Freight for years, people who had watched Daniela's rise and my quiet steadiness with equal familiarity, did not celebrate what happened to her, and I did not want them to. Most of them simply told me, in small private moments over the following weeks, some version of the same sentence. We always wondered how you put up with it. I did not have a clean answer for them then, and I am not sure I have one now except to say that I put up with it for a long time because I believed keeping the peace was its own kind of strength. Understand now that it is not the same thing as strength. Keeping the peace protects the person causing the harm. Boundaries protect everyone else. There is a difference between revenge and self-respect, and I think about that difference often, because it would have been easy to make this uglier than it needed to be, to leak the story to every relative who ever laughed at that party, to post the forensic audit publicly, to say cruel things about my sister in rooms where she could not defend herself. I did not do any of that. I did the next right thing, which was gathering the truth and handing it to people whose job it was to weigh it fairly. And I let the truth do what truth does when you finally stop protecting the people it implicates. Revenge wants someone to suffer. Self-respect simply refuses to suffer quietly on someone else's behalf anymore, and it turns out those two things can look almost identical from the outside, while feeling completely different on the inside. I still have the dollar bill. It is folded inside a small frame on my desk at Voss Freight. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly how little I once let myself be worth in that family, and exactly how far one quiet, patient decision to stop accepting that can carry you. So I want to ask you something before you go, because I have a feeling some of you are watching this with your own version of a dollar bill folded away somewhere, a moment where someone showed you exactly how little they thought you deserved, and you smiled for the camera anyway. What is the one moment that finally made you stop keeping the peace, and what did you do with it? Tell me in the comments because I read every single one, and some of your stories are the reason I keep making these. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.